Yeah, so I gotta say, this is the topic we get the most questions about, and I want to thank everybody that sent in questions because we ask people to send in questions, and we're fine with any kind of questions, but this time, almost all the questions were right to the topic, and I'm going to try to answer as many of those as were asked inside the presentation, and then we'll see if we've got some time to do some other ones. So the first question that I got was this. And I thought, well, that's dumb. And then I thought, well, wait a minute. You need to understand. I mean, there's so many things that we do that we don't even think about, right? We don't even, it's just like unquestioned, you do it. And you forget why sometimes. And so let's talk about why we actually need to aim antennas. Well, let's take an example here, just with audio, because I think most people understand this. They've done this a lot, right? So you got yourself a singer. You stick a microphone in front of the singer. All good, right? So that could be an antenna, pointed at a receiving end, excuse me, a transmitter pointing at a receiving antenna. But let's keep it in the audio realm for just a minute. So if you've got some noise around that singer, you don't want to pick up the noise, you just want to pick up the singer, I assume. So if you get the mic close to the singer and farther away from the noise, as you can see, we've got a good strong signal from the singer and not so much noise. As you begin to back that microphone away from the singer, the proportion of the singer, our intended pickup, gets less compared to the noise. They get closer together. And the farther you get the microphone away from that singer, the more of the residual noise you pick up until you get to a point where you've got as much noise in the signal as you do the singer. So at this point, turning up the singer in a PA system is about useless, right? Because you've got so much noise. And then if you don't have your microphone aimed at the singer, your intended pickup, it gets even worse. In this case, you get more noise than the singer. It's completely useless, right? Okay, so audio, microphones, and radio RF signals follow something called inverse square law. And to greatly simplify this, it means that every time you double the distance, you have 1/4 of the power. And that's because it's expanding in two directions. It's not just expanding wide, right? So think about this if the signal coming out, is in a triangle, as it gets wider, if it were smoke, it wouldn't be as smoky as you get distance, right? But it's also expanding in height. That's why it's 1/4 of the power and not half the power. Okay, so let's remember inverse square law. So, what do we care? Why are we aiming microphones? Well, this is the thing, and you're probably tired of seeing this slide by now, but this is the thing we have to do. There's 87 ways to make this happen, and there's 87 ways to screw this up, but this has to happen. So we have to vary all those 87 things, and we have to end up with our intended microphone signals, our radio signals, to be at least 20 dB hotter than whatever the noise floor is wherever you are, and that changes every place. So that has to happen, and when that happens, we get capture effect on the radios, and our radios lock to the signal, and we're good to go. We're not going to have dropouts. We're not going to worry about it, as long as we can maintain that. So one of the things is aiming, one of the 87 reasons, and a big one, is aiming the antenna at what you're trying to pick up and avoiding everything you're not trying to pick up as much as possible, right? So some of the simple best practices that we have to deal with. The first one is line of sight. So the very simple way to do this is so we're talking about wireless microphones, and everything I say about microphones is the same for in-ear monitors, except it's backwards. Okay, if you put your head where that antenna is, you better be able to see the transmitting microphone, right? And if you can do that, you've got line of sight. If there's a wall in between you, if it's going around a corner, in the case you put your receiver too low and it's trying to penetrate all those bodies, you're going to lose a lot of signal. And at some point, that's going to drop your dynamic range, that 20 dB that we're trying to hit, begins falling quickly, right? So this is the biggest one. If your microphone can't see the receiving antenna, you're in for a world of hurt. Okay. We also need to remember that you can be too close to an antenna. And so, again, if I go back to an audio example, if you're listening to a PA system from 50 feet or 100 feet away and it's the right level, if you put your head up a foot away from that speaker, it's no longer the right level. It's going to blow your head off. And it's the same thing. You can get your transmitters too close to your antennas and you overload the front end, right? Uh, so this is kind of it depends how strong your transmitter is, but kind of keep this in mind. You don't want to get real close uh, to your antenna. And likewise, you don't want to get real far away, but you don't want to get any closer than this to these because you'll probably begin to distort the front end of your receiver. Um, Obviously, we don't want to have antenna farms. This screws up all kinds of things. We would like to have just an A and a B antenna in a room that, I don't know, is 200 feet long, 300 feet long, holds 1,000, 1,500 people. Most of the time, you should be able to cover that with one A and one B, like two paddles or a diversity fin or any of our diversity antennas. You should be able to do that, and you'll do better with fewer antennas. The other thing with this is it's nearly impossible to to focus your antennas to your receivers, and if you don't do that, the antenna's ability to pick up the signal from the transmitter can drop to, you could lose 20 dB of signal. So with this, you can't move those antennas. You can't bend them because you'll touch another antenna, which completely destroys everything. Okay. So when you mount your antennas, there's a couple of things that you want to normally do as best you can. You can't always do this, but you'd like to not mount antennas on the wall if you can avoid it. You'd like to be at least a wavelength off the wall. And so this isn't a deal breaker. This is a little more or a little less level in that dynamic range that we're trying to do. What happens is as your antennas get really close to the wall, less than a wavelength, so 2 feet, that's for here in the US. For those in Europe or something, it might be a little bit shorter than that, but it increases the multipath, and that just makes it harder for everything. Likewise, in order to maintain line of sight, we need to be above head height. And we don't want to be too much above head height. You can put your antennas too high, okay? If you mount your antenna 20 or 30 feet up in the air, you could make that work, but you have to account for that because now it's even farther away, right? It says it's 10 feet farther up, and you have to focus it the right direction. But usually just above head height, somewhere in a 7 to 10 foot kind of range above the deck, right? So if it's above the stage and your stage is 4 feet up, we're talking where people are going to stand. So this would be, as a general rule, your best practice. Now, you don't have to follow these best practices if you have enough dynamic range. If you have 40 dB of dynamic range, remember we have to have 20. If you have 40, there's lots of things you can do wrong and still work. But don't count on that 40 being there all the time because somebody's going to do something stupid, like put their hand over the antenna and cut the signal in half. So you always want as much dynamic range as you can get. Especially, you don't want to give away anything that you could get for free, certainly. You may want to consider some lower cost options, like adding bandpass filters and things like that, as opposed to going out and buying $5,000 radios. That works real well too. And sometimes that's the level of quality you need because you just can't tolerate any dropouts. It just depends. Another thing you want to do is you want to keep antennas away from metal. So you can see these are up on a truss, but they're up on poles to get them away from the metal. Now the CP beam antennas are a special case in that they have a backplate, and you can mount those directly to a wall, and you can mount those directly up against truss. But most antennas, your whips, your paddles, that kind of thing, don't like to be real close to metal. Again, it doesn't stop you, it lowers that dynamic range, right? This is always trade-offs. There isn't just one thing to do that's going to fix this for you, and there probably isn't one thing you've done, I'll say wrong, but not as optimally as you could have, that's going to sink you. This is a whole lot of things, moving together in a very delicate dance. And so we're just trying to pay attention to all these things and line up as many good things as we can without giving away anything that we don't have to, right? All right, so aiming antennas. So the first thing you need to decide is what do you need to cover, right? Because we don't want to cover anything we don't need, right? So when you if you want to cover if it were lights and you want to cover a basketball gym, you need a big light at the top that covers the whole thing. But, if you lost your keys at night in the backyard, you don't need to light the whole backyard. You could have a flashlight and just light where you point it and not do everything else. Not that it's a problem with your backyard, but with radios, if you're getting signal that you don't need or don't want, your receiver has to deal with that. And we're trying to make it as easy on your receivers as possible. So we don't want to cover anything we don't need. So my picture there with the red is showing an omnidirectional and a directional antenna, right? So if all I need to cover is a stage and I don't want to cover anything behind me, I want to use a directional antenna. Here we go. The next question I get all the time is, well, how about an Omni? It picks up everything. So the question is, do you want to pick up everything? You probably don't. In my case, most of the time I don't. Most of the time I want to pick up somebody on a stage. So when you use an Omni, remember it's going in 360 degrees, right? So it's going as far forward as it is going backward. When you use a directional antenna, you kind of cut off the back half and shove it to the front half. So it feels like it goes farther. It goes farther in one direction and it goes not as far closer to zero in the other direction. Same way with your cardioid microphone or your omnidirectional microphone. It depends what you're trying to pick up. You just want to use the right tool for the job. Now, if you want to use an Omni, essentially it needs to be in the center of whatever it is you're trying to pick up. So here, if I got a park, I'm doing a county fair, I want to pick up everything in the park. And if I can put that antenna somewhere in the middle of the park, that's kind of what I'm looking at. In this case, if I use a directional antenna, I may be picking up the stage in one direction, but I'm not picking up the petting zoo on the other side. And that may be what you want. If I need to pick up the petting zoo and the stage, then I want to use an omnidirectional and cover everything. So it's just a matter of deciding what you want to cover and try not to cover anything else as much as you can. That's very difficult, but conceptually, that's what we're trying to do here. Okay? So where does our antenna cover? So if you go to anybody's website, spec pages, they probably have polar patterns. For the most part, we're really only concerned with the horizontal because it's very rare that we're trying to get somebody on a stage and somebody 40 feet up in the air at the same time. I don't know. If you're doing the Royal Albert Hall with 4 balconies, maybe you are. But for the most part, we're really only paying attention to the horizontal. And in fact, when you go to a lot of these websites, you're really only going to see the coverage horizontally. So, and most of the time you don't have to think anything else about that unless there's something up in the air. If you've got an X-ray machine over the top of your stage, well, send me a picture because I've never seen it. But if you have something like that, possibly if you had a building, well, if you had a building with a cell phone tower on top of it or a radio transmitter, that happens. Again, not very often, but something to think about. So let's just think about horizontal. So I'm pretty sure everybody knows how to aim a rifle. You point it at what you want to shoot, right? So that's called bore sight, and that would be the on axis. So if we look over on the right, that's a polar pattern for a paddle antenna. It's very similar to a cardioid microphone, right? And the difference between brands is very small. They're pretty much all the same. So if you consider that, if you're standing at the middle and you point your rifle up to 12 o'clock, that's on axis. That's going to be the strongest part of the signal, right? And then as you get away, you'll notice the pattern, the blue line there begins to get dimmer and dimmer as we get farther and farther off axis. Now it doesn't stop. It's everywhere the blue line is. You can see going backwards, it's not going very well. It's what do we got there? I don't know. It's 20 dB down going backwards. So just remember that this antenna is the -6 points are probably 60 degrees to each side if it were a paddle. So it's still picking that up. Not quite as strong as it does directly on axis. That's the same way with a microphone. It still picks you up if you talk into the side of it. Not as good as if you talk directly on axis straight in the front. So you can look at these polars if you're using different antennas and just make sure that the antenna is going in the direction that you think it is. Now, kind of a help for us is that this is generally considered normal. That human beings, their stereo vision is normally about 120 degrees. So that's great. So if you're going to mount a paddle antenna on a wall someplace, put your head right under that antenna with your nose, going the same way as the fin is pointing out. And what you can see is what you're going to cover well. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't cover other places, but it starts getting a whole lot weaker, right? So just simply, wherever you think, let's say I think I'll put my antenna on this wall. Put your head there and see if you can see where your transmitters are going to be. If you can't see them, you might want to think about that again, right? So this is no meters needed. Just use your vision. This is close enough for to work actually quite well. So just remember that we see about 120 degrees wide. That's about the pattern. That's about the horizontal width of a paddle antenna. The next question I get all the time is, how far will my antenna go? How far back can I put it? And it depends on a whole lot of things, not just that distance, right? So your antenna is catching what you're throwing at it. So it depends how hard you're throwing, and it depends how strong the noise floor is. Because remember, how far it goes is the distance that we can maintain that 20 dB dynamic range. Because the antenna itself has no limit. It will go billions of miles. It'll get extremely weak, but it's still picking up the signal, right? I don't know if you saw, they reconnected with Voyager a few weeks back. That's 15 billion miles away from Earth. And it's using a 1975 radio powered by solar cells that are so far away from the sun, I don't know if it shines out that far. And NASA, if you have a $5 million radio, can still pick that up. So there's no distance limit to the antenna yourself. The other thing I'll say about that is that A lot of people think, oh, I'll do better if I have a stronger antenna. And that's not really the case, right? If you're only trying to pick up at 100 feet or 300 feet or 50 feet, why would you want an antenna that's still picking up signals strongly at 1,000 feet? Because if you only need to go 50 feet or 100 feet, everything else you pick up is noise, and it's raising that noise floor, and it's diminishing that dynamic range. So we don't want super powerful antennas. I know that's just normally intuitively the way we think. If it's bigger and stronger, I got extra and I'll be covered. You don't really want that. What you really want is to answer that question, how far does my antenna, not how far does it go, but how far can my system work is really the right question. Okay. And so what we do is we calculate what's called a link budget. So we look at all the things that add gain, and then we look at all the things that lose gain, and we get that all the way down to the end and calculate it out. And so we end up in the blue on the bottom right side there, we end up with a signal level from our transmitter, and there's a noise floor. And so that CNR, carrier noise ratio, or dynamic range, same thing, needs to end up being at least 20 dB different. Well, you can get out the measurements and do all the calculations, or we have these cool tools on our website. If you just go to rfvenue.com, there's a round button on every page that says performance tools. And if you click on that, it takes you to this page. So to answer the question, how far will my antenna coverage be? You want to click on the one that says check your performance. And we've made this really simple. That just go to these drop down boxes, tell me what brand of mic you've got, how far away from the antenna you are, how far your cables are, blah, 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 and kick that calculate button. And if you get a green light, that means you will have at least 20 dB of signal to your radio, right? So now that doesn't mean you have a clear channel to operate on. That's a separate part. But the power side of this is correct, and you're going to be good. Obviously, if you get a yellow light or a red light, you're going to have to make some changes. But this makes it really easy. This shouldn't take you a minute to do. And I would double check, every job you send out, every time you go do anything. Just look on this. It's really quick and easy. Okay, so back to aiming antennas. Well, if you've got a whip antenna, you don't really aim them because in the horizontal, they go everywhere until they get blocked, right? So it doesn't matter if you're pointing your antenna straight up and down vertically, from 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock. You're covering everything in every direction 360 degrees. If you're using a paddle type antenna, you're probably covering more or less 120 degrees. So a third of that, right? If you ever look up at cell phone towers, they've always got three sides, right? They have 120 degrees in three directions. That's how they do it. And if you wanted to cover 360 degrees at a much greater distance, you could use three paddles and set them just like cell phone towers, 120 degrees apart. And then we have helical antennas. This is the one you typically see on the football field. I mean, they come in different shapes and sizes. And typically, they're much narrower. Typically, they're around 60 degrees. There are some that are even more narrow. And that's good for avoiding, outside interference, but it means your transmitter's pretty well got to nail the guy's shoe down. He can't walk too many steps one side or the other till he falls out of the pattern. But that might be the right thing for what you need to do. So just remember, this is kind of when you're looking at a job, this is what I need to do. These are mainly the choices that you're going to find in wireless microphone world. So radio waves more or less move in straight lines. The distances we're covering, we'll just consider them straight lines. If you're doing ham radio, you got to consider the curvature of the earth. But at 100 feet, we don't have to deal with the curvature of the earth. So we'll just call it a straight line, right? So it just points where you shoot it. So let's say you got an auditorium. Well, typically I see the antennas mounted at the back of the back wall, at the front of house position or somewhere near that, pointed towards the stage. Again, that antenna, if it's a paddle, is 120 degrees wide. You can see it very quickly fills out and covers that whole stage. I'm going to cover most of the audience and I'm going to cover that stage. No problem. If I do need to cover the auditorium, so if you have a play where the actors need to work out amongst the audience, or you have a church where the pastor likes to walk out in the congregation, uh, or you have a town hall meeting where they pass around a question and answer microphone. Putting it in the corner, obviously it's a 120-degree wide pattern and you're into a 90-degree angle. You cover that entire room. Where if you put it on the back wall and point it straight, you may be a little weak in those corners. Of course, you're closer to the antenna, so that kind of makes up for it. But this would be another perfectly good way to do this, no problem. However, if you can get your antenna closer to your transmitters, so in this case, I'm definitely saying I don't need the back of the room. I don't even want the back of the room. If I get my antenna closer to my transmitters, so I'm assuming I've got wireless microphones on the stage, they'll get a stronger signal. In other words, the signal from that transmitter as I move the antenna closer will be stronger. In general practice, we're going to consider the noise in the room to be essentially the same everywhere in the room. Now, again, that's going to vary if you've got an X-ray machine in the corner, but like who does? So we're going to consider the noise to be about the same everywhere in the room. If it's extremely critical, we're going to walk test and we're going to measure all that. But most of the time, we're going to say there's as much RF noise right in front of the stage as there is in the center of the auditorium as there is just about anywhere you go. Okay. If I move the antenna even closer, then again my signal goes up, but my noise doesn't change. So you see, watch the green go up, and that raises that dynamic range. So when you can do this, you get more signal and less noise, signal to noise ratio. You get a larger dynamic range. Something to consider. Now, for a lot of people, you don't have to do this. It's better, but you'll have plenty of coverage on the back of the wall. So I'm not saying you can't do that. It depends on distance. It depends on how powerful your mics are. It depends on things. But if you're having a tough time with your antenna all the way on the back wall, you may want to move it and hang it down from lighting truss or whatever might make sense. Mechanically, you have to kind of figure this out. But this will give you a stronger signal and the noise won't change. So that's good. A lot of times I get asked about multiple antenna. Well, how about if I just put another antenna out there? And the answer is you need to isolate them, right? If you don't isolate them, if your receiver is picking up two different signals that are essentially the same signal, but from two different locations, because the timing is almost always going to be different. There's like one spot in the world where it wouldn't be, but that's a 2-inch circle. And if you move out of that, you're sending the signal in different, they're out of time with each other. That makes them out of phase with each other. And that means you're almost certainly going to be canceling some signal. So while you thought this may be making a stronger signal, it most certainly is making a weaker signal unless you can zone them off. Now, I'm not putting a wall there, but the way we would do this is use something like our 4-zone combiner where I can turn down the antennas. So probably if I needed to do this, and there are times you need to do this, right? Then what you got to do is you need to make each of your antennas weaker, right? We don't want them to be as strong because we really want the transmitter to only see one antenna at a time. So when we're up on the stage, we'd like it to see the stage antenna. And if we've got to walk to the back of the hall, we don't want it to see the stage antenna. We want it to see the auxiliary antenna. Now, of course, if you're in multiple rooms, if you want to put an antenna in the green room so you can check that people have their mics turned on before they walk on stage, that's a perfect way to do it. And obviously, if there's walls, if you have multiple rooms, a lot of times where these walls come and go would be like hotel ballrooms where they can pull out these walls. And in that case, you really would always like an A and a B antenna in any enclosed space, unless the space is huge. So if we're talking about convention centers, that's a different thing. But if we're talking about, normal size auditorium, soft seater, 1,000, 1,500 people kind of thing, you're probably better off with doing it with one pair of antennas. But you can do it this way. You just have to be able to dial down the power from each of those antennas. Or you could put the antenna, on a sidewall of the stage in one of the wings. That side or the other doesn't really matter. If all I really want to cover is the stage, I'm going to get some of the audience. You can see it leaks out there, but I've eliminated some part of the audience, and that means I'm not picking up their cell phones. So that's something to consider. If all you need to cover is the stage, try to keep the concentration on the stage and away from everything else. Okay, so what if you've got weird shaped rooms? Remember, radio waves move in a straight line. So if I put an antenna, and remember, I got to have a pair. So if we're doing diversity, this would be two paddles or a D-fin, simple way to do it. Then what I'm going to get is I'm going to get coverage straight out that room, but when I go down the L, that corner of the room there, the wall is blocking that signal a little bit. So I'm not going to get direct coverage in some part of that room. Now that may still work for you if the room's small enough, because you're going to get reflected coverage. But we try not to count on that. I'd rather have direct coverage. If I'm designing a room, I don't want to do it this way. If the show's got to go on in 5 minutes and I've got no other choice, then that's where I'm at. I'll try it and see if it works. It will in some cases and it won't in others. But this is not a good design. I could put it on this wall, and you see I'm going to cover part of that room that's going down, but not directly. So again, back in that corner, it's going to be weaker. Now that may be good. Maybe I want to exclude something that's in that corner, like all the video equipment. That would be a good reason to do it this way. The other thing I can say is, again, because you're closer to the antenna, you don't have to pay as much attention to the pattern, right? The pattern doesn't really develop until you get at least a little bit of distance. And then, again, because of that inverse square law, I'm close to the antenna, so I'm pretty powerful, even though the antenna's not pointed directly at me. So you just consider all these things. There's not one answer that works all the time. Like I said, there's 87 things. This is one of them. So like, oh, well, how about if I put a paddle on each end of the room like this? And the answer is you'll get coverage, but you won't necessarily have diversity coverage, right? Because you will really only get diversity coverage where these two overlap. Again, that might work for you, but it's not a best practice. You'd like to have diversity coverage everywhere, right? So you could think about it this way, like if this were a football field and I put a paddle under each goalpost and pointed it towards the field, I would have coverage of the entire field, right? But I would only have diversity in the section where the east coverage and the west coverage are close enough together to be, about equal, some proportion of that. But if I get right down under the goal line on the west end, I don't have very much coverage at all from the east end antenna. So I don't have diversity. I have coverage, but I don't have diversity. So you just got to remember this. Sometimes this is the only way you can go. Sometimes this works. There isn't always, every time you do wireless, it's kind of a unique experience, right? It's never happened before because your audience won't be the same and the things they have in their pocket won't be the same. And whoever's transmitting down the street isn't going to be the same as it was an hour ago. And all these things are always changing. So you'd really like to have diversity. So back to our funny shaped L-shaped room. If I use this corner and I aim across, if I focus this on axis to that corner, this is going to spread out and cover the whole room. So if I need to cover this L-shaped room and I can put my antenna there, that's what I'm gonna cover the whole room. Um, I get a lot of questions. Can I put my transmitters and my receivers in the same rack? And for the most part, it doesn't really matter where those are. What matters is where their antennas are. I mean, they do interact a little bit. It's not zero, but what we're concerned with is the antennas. So in this rack where they've got, well, this is not the way to do it, but the biggest problem here is they've got the IEM transmitting antennas right next to the wireless microphone receiving antennas. And in that case, the power that the IEMs is transmitting is screaming into the ears of the microphone wireless. So the way you solve this, or the way you begin to solve this, would be to move those IEMs to a combiner and then run a cable out and have your transmitting antenna away from your rack. Even better, they should combine their wireless mic antennas. They might get away with this, they might get away with it this year. They might not next year. That's another question, but there you go. So it really matters. What we're really concerned with is where the antennas are, where the transducers are, because we're dealing with the radio waves. And at this point, it's antennas that deal with the radio waves. Yeah, there's some possibility the electronics may leak a little bit. They may radiate a little bit of garbage. Everything's digital now, and everything that's digital does. But it's in a metal box that should, for the most part, block that. So unless your requirement is ultra critical, you can get away with this. I do it all the time. I don't worry about it. Yeah, so that's what we got to do. We got to keep the wireless mic receiving antennas away from the transmitting antennas. If you think about this, kind of the way you do a microphone pointed at a speaker, you get feedback. Well, you don't get feedback with the radio, but you get a problem, just like you get a problem here. So this one's pretty easy. Point one of them or the other direction, and you'll get a lot more gain before feedback. So it's the same way. You don't want to point your wireless microphone receiving antennas. You don't want to point them into your transmitting antenna's path. So again, if we want to put these on stage, we want to put them both on the same side, pointed in the same direction. Okay. We separate them a little bit so they don't directly interfere with each other. Usually a couple of 3 wavelengths is a pretty good starting point, about 6 feet. About 6 to 10 feet apart is going to be reasonable. What we don't want to do is put the IEM transmitter on one side or while the wireless microphone antenna is on the other, where they're pointed at each other. You've created yourself a whole world of hurt when you do this. So they both need to be on the same wall, or they can both be on the back wall, pointed at the stage. This is fine. You could even, if you have to, if you had one antenna in the wing and one antenna on the back wall where they're 90 degrees apart, that's reasonable, shall we say. Better this way, but that's not, it's not a deal breaker usually. Again, it depends where you are because every time you set up is going to be unique. So this is what we want to do with our antennas. So not only aiming our antennas, but considering these other things. So the first most important one, don't not do this one. If you don't have line of sight, you're going to have a tough day, right? So that's the most important one. Put your head where the antenna is and look and see if you can see where the transmitters are. That almost certainly needs to happen. Um, if you can choose a better antenna for the job, in other words, an antenna that goes where you point it, goes where you need to have pickup coverage, and doesn't go anywhere else. Now, you'll never get it that close, but as much as you can do that, um, that's what you need to do. Obviously, aiming the antenna is pointing the on-axis response of the antenna directly at the transmitter. Now, that's easy to do if you've got one transmitter and you nail the guy's shoes down. If he's walking all over the place, well, then you've got a really big coverage area, and you have to just take that all into consideration, you know. Um, Sometimes an Omni is right, but again, with a paddle antenna that has 120 degree coverage, and you're in a more or less rectangular room, in any corner of the room, it covers that entire space, right? You don't want to pick up anything you don't need to, right? That's just adding extra burden on the system. So we don't want to pick up the audience if we don't need that, if we don't need any transmitters in that space. That's usually the way this works out. Um, so that's something to remember. And if you have really difficult situations, you may need a zone system where we have a whole bunch of limited antennas that each pick up a specific area, right? So if you have a long, we did a casino somewhere, Oklahoma, I think, and they wanted coverage for the master of ceremonies to be able to walk anywhere down the main aisle from the front door to the back door, and that distance happened to be 1,000 meters, half a mile. And we zoned that system with 16 antennas, and he was able to walk from the front door to the back door half a mile and have coverage everywhere he went. That's, I don't do that every day, but we do that. So it's possible you have a restaurant and you want the microphone to be able to work in multiple rooms, then we have to put a pair of antennas in each room. If you just put, some people think, well, I'll just put the A antenna in this room and the B antenna in this room, and I'll hope I get enough leakage through the wall to have diversity. I don't know. You win the lottery a lot, you're gambling. It might work. It might not work. It might work great. I wouldn't design a system that way. But, people have budgets, and if the rooms are tiny, and depends what the walls are made out of. Although these days, almost all the walls have metal studs, and you might as well just consider them solid metal walls at that point. But, it is what it is. So I think with that, Mr. Adam, I've used up most of the time, and I think you've got some questions that may or may not have been in that prezo. So what do you got for me?
Absolutely. Good stuff here. So the first question we've got here is, why aren't helical antennas usually used to receive?
I ask myself that all the time. I think it's because they're kind of newer. I mean, helical antennas never really got used until we had to worry about satellites, where we had to worry about moving things, right? Your television station is on a mountain and it transmits to an antenna on top of your house and nothing moves ever. But with a satellite, it's going across the sky. So you've either got to put your antenna on a motor and track it, which is big and expensive and difficult, or you can use the helical antenna. Now, I don't know the answer to this, but I wonder, had helical antennas, well, the other thing is helical antennas are more expensive. So there's a cost factor. But if we got to do what we got to do, we need a performance, or why are we even there? So sometimes that's the answer to the cost. But I wonder if back in the beginning, when spatial diversity, so your receivers now have two receivers in them. You have an A antenna and a B antenna, and it picks the strongest radio, and that's the one it works with. I wonder, had helical antennas been more plentiful back when they started doing that, if they wouldn't have gone to helical antennas. I mean, that's basically what your cell phone's got in it, right? because who knows how you're going to twist it and who knows where it's going to be. And so it doesn't matter. Helical antennas take the take the polarization issue away. In other words, if you're not lined up with your antenna anymore, with linear antennas, your signal drops. With a helical antenna, it doesn't matter how you twist and turn, right? So it doesn't matter if you hold your transmitter vertically, horizontally, or anywhere in between. With a helical antenna, essentially nothing changes. With a whip or a paddle, you get enormous changes, right? You can drop 99% of your signal because your transmitter is at the wrong angle to your linear antenna. That's why we use two. Hopefully it doesn't happen to two at the same time, but it still does. So a helical is the answer. So that's the best answer I can give you to that question.
Cool. This is a good one. So, any use of gain provided by the antenna distro. Example would be AWDAD-M224, which I believe is a small compact distro with +6 and +10 functionality.
Is that on the distro or the antenna?
Well, the question is about the distro, and the one cited does have two different selectable gain settings.
So so gain to the antenna signal um, after the fact. I mean, you could use a stronger transmitter. That would be a different story. But if you're using gain like in an active antenna, that's really kind of the wrong place to use it. We'd like not to add gain if we absolutely don't have to. And I got to tell you that most times I see people with active antennas, if you replace that with a passive antenna, it'd work exactly the same way. In fact, it might even work better because you'd lower the noise floor. But that's a different story. So we'd like to avoid adding gain. The way we would like to do it is to reduce noise. That's not always possible, and sometimes we have enormous distances, and there's no other way to do it than to use amplifiers. But that's one time out of 100 or a couple times out of 1,000. It's better not to use that. Again, you can go back and that's where that link budget comes in. And if you've got really big, unusual things, then we're going to have to get out the numbers and, use weapons of math destruction and calculate all that stuff. But we'd rather not do it with amplification. What we'd rather do is not lose signal. So that means I'd rather use an antenna that has passive gain. Oh, I should have said active gain. So antennas produce gain by focusing, right? Like a megaphone. When you put a megaphone in front of your mouth, instead of the sound going sideways out your mouth, it kind of goes in the direction you pointed. And so it feels like gain. It is if you're in the pickup area and it blocks it if you're not. But it's not like an amplifier because amplifiers always add other problems, right? They add intermodulation distortion, and that adds to your noise floor and that screws your radios up. So we try to avoid gain if we don't need it. You don't absolutely need it. Sometimes you will, but almost never, really.
And here you go. There's another one. Can you connect an active antenna to an IEM combiner?
None that I've ever seen. So you're going the wrong direction. That would be that would be like asking if I could stick a microphone into the speaker output of my amplifier. It's going the wrong direction to start with. So you can amplify signals. There are special amplifiers that amplify the signal going to the antenna. Okay, but it's not going to be in the antennas that you normally see that are active. It's a specialty thing. It almost certainly requires a license because you'll be exceeding the legal power limits. If you're a TV station, you can do that, but it's a very expensive amplifier as well. So no, you're going in the wrong end. You're going the wrong direction is usually the case.
Awesome. Here's a good one. When using both Sennheiser and Shure equipment on stage, is it best to place antennas in separate areas?
Well, if you're asking, is there any problem by mixing brands? The answer is almost certainly no, there isn't. Right. So you don't have to have a separate end system for one brand and a separate system for another brand because of the brand, right? Because we're dealing with radio waves, electromagnetic waves, a force of nature. They're the same everywhere in the universe. And so nobody has a proprietary radio wave. So you don't have to worry that the radio waves don't fit. Now, what the radios do once they capture that wave, yeah, you can't use a Shure microphone into a Sennheiser receiver, probably. There's a few tiny exceptions, but that's not going to work. But you can use a Shure antenna into a Sennheiser distro or a Sennheiser receiver. That's not a problem. As long as you've got an antenna that's in the right frequency range.
Nice. All right. So are IEM antennas best placed behind the band due to belt packs usually being placed on the musician's backside?
Well, let's think about that. So yes, if you place the antenna in a wing, so I'm assuming you've got a stage full of people and they're facing forward to the audience, and they put their receivers on their back or on their hip on the side that's facing the antenna. As they turn, they're going to block some of that out. It's unavoidable. Kind of, it doesn't matter where you put the antenna, somebody's going to move in a direction that puts their body in between their receiving antenna and the transmitting antenna. So, but people do put the antennas uh, upstage, all the way on the back wall, maybe even, and point them out. Now, you can do that, and that may be better. Uh, but you also have to consider when you do that, that it's quite easy for your performers to get too close to that antenna and have problems because of that, right? So when you get, so if you're a band on stage and and you have your transmitting antenna wherever it is, somebody's going to be pretty close to that, and that guy might have problems because his receiver could very frequently be being overdriven, and you're going to start getting noises and distortion and just stuff you don't want. So again, it's all about trade-offs. There's not just an answer that's always right. Whatever I do to make something better, I have to give up something somewhere else. It's like the conservation of energy thing. To get something, I have to give something up. So I try to get something I need and give up something I don't care about. Now there's not a clear line. That's sometimes that's an easy choice, but it's always a trade-off. So that's one of the 87 things. So sometimes that works better. Um, you can try it. You can measure these things, right? So, you can take a scanner out and you can measure what's happening, and see if it is one way or the other. And if you're in this as a business and you do this all the time, you better have a scanner because it's getting to the point where we can't just guess anymore. So there's a tool to measure and give you the answer that you asked for. It's going to be better in one place than the other. It's just not going to be the same answer in every venue. That's why it's difficult. So yeah, so getting out and walk testing your system and seeing, because it may be great for some of your ones and then it kills your other ones. So you kind of got to look at all of that. So there's never just one answer.
Hey,
Um,
Don, I was going to say real quick, everything you're saying is perfect, and on top of that, too, documenting all your data. Meaning, if you're traveling around and going to building, you being organized as an RF expert is the key to being consistent with your results. So you don't repeat the same mistakes in the same buildings.
yes. Yeah. Yeah. You don't let the same dog bite you twice. So yeah, you do you do need to keep to keep records of such things. Again, it depends how important, if you're doing big money stuff, if you're doing Elton John at the Enorma Dome, uh, you do this a little different than if you're doing, five microphones at your church, probably. Not to say that that's not important. It's just there's a whole lot of money running on one and probably not on the other. Any churches I've been to. So yeah, you do want to keep track of things as best you can.